I'm gonna do 5 videos on the power of the bishop pair. Bishops can be really good, but it takes some time to realize why and when. So that's going to be my goal for this series. Myself, I think I only realized how good the bishops were after I became a grandmaster, and hopefully I'm gonna manage to explain to you why that is. Our first game will be a game I played in the European Team Championship against Aloisas Kvainis of Lithuania. The game started with d4, and we quickly got into what's called a BOGO Indian, in which black plays his bishop out and gives a check. It's kind of the cousin of the Nimzo Indian, only here white gets the option of, instead of putting his knight up to c3, he can instead play the knight to d2, as I did. The main difference is that and now we don't have to worry about our pawn structure being compromised, and on the next move we will play our pawn out to a3, attacking the bishop and very often getting the bishop pair. Both players are happy about the situation. Black has a solid position with good development, whereas white's development is not that fantastic, but he has the bishop pair. He's hoping to exploit that in the long run. Actually, often in the opening, you will see that white is the one that starts lagging behind in developing. I think it's a quite interesting point because often white feels that he can afford to not develop his pieces as quickly as black, and he uses that extra time to get some long-term advantages, and then he's hoping that the short-term advantage of good development will be equalized later in the game, and white keeps his long-term advantage, which is the bishop pair. Both players are developing their pieces, getting on good squares. And here, black with knight e4, threatening the queen, and then f5, we see he has aggressive intentions. He wants to use the long diagonal down towards the white king, and also get the rook up to the 6th rank so that it starts looking down on supporting the attack together with the black bishop. So there are aggressive intentions, and therefore I felt that I wanted to block the black bishop. It's a very standard idea. I played the pawn to d5, blocking the diagonal, and the idea is that if black were to take this pawn, then knight to d4 is a very strong move. Black is actually in trouble on the light squares, especially e6 and f5. And in the near future, white can push his pawn, chase away the black knight, and then open an attack towards the f5 pawn. So in almost all cases, this is a very good situation for white. Now, after d5, Kvainis was up to the task. He plays a very good move, c5. The point being that now this pawn takes away the d4 square, which the white knight really wanted to use. So as it turned out, I was really regretting my last move d5 because he had this excellent counterstrike, and I went forward too quickly. I'm not ready to support my aggressive intentions with the d5 pawn. Actually, here I went into some stop the bleeding mode. I felt I had played something wrong, and if I were to take this free pawn on e6, black easily gets it back after queen e7. There's no way to defend it, and I felt like in this situation, black has excellent pieces. The knight on e5, the bishop open on the long diagonal, and there are actually good chances for an attack for black. You'll also notice that the white bishops aren't really accomplishing much because the position is quite closed. There are a lot of pawns, and that's a situation where the knights really can be powerful. So after c5, I decided to take this pawn en passant. And after knight takes c6, I played knight d2. I think basically admitting that my opening strategy was a failure. I'm trying to remove the good-looking e4 knight, and then after that just getting my pieces out as fast as possible. Now, Kranis played knight e5, and after f3, trying to force the exchange, he went back. It's illogical that he wants to avoid taking on d2 because then my bishop gets out. But as it turns out, here maybe he could create some pressure against the c4 pawn. In the continuation he played, it made sense going back because the bishop is going to take forever to get out. But the question is, how bad is white's problem of developing? What can black accomplish when white is undeveloped? So after b3, rook c8, looking down on the white queen, I played queen d1, undeveloping the queen, as it were, and my bishop is still not out yet. Even so, I actually believe white's position here is quite okay, because while white has been spending a lot of time not really getting his pieces out, it's not clear how black should punish him. When there's a lack of punishment, the situation is this, that black has quite good pieces on quite good squares, but it's not clear what he wants to do next. Whereas white has very clear ideas about how to continue. Now he wants to get the bishop out, he wants to get the queen over to the king side, protecting his pawns, and he wants probably to play a rook to the central files and maybe storm with the pawns on the queen side. Now, all of this is very time consuming, but if your opponent doesn't manage to improve his position, you might actually get enough time to do all of that stuff. The computer thinks this position is about equal, but because of what I've been saying, I think it might be mistaken. I think it looks at the position, sees that black has good pieces now, and it doesn't realize that it's difficult for black to make progress, whereas white has a very easy plan and very good intentions for the next couple of moves. I actually think in this case the computer is underestimating the white bishop pair, and hopefully in the continuation you will understand how powerful those bishops can be. They don't look too impressive now, but let's go forward a couple of moves. Black plays his queen out, I get my bishop to b2, the long diagonal, knight g6, and now queen e1. I want to place my queen close to the king because black has actually some pieces potentially mounting an attack towards my king, And also I want to protect this pawn on e3. So I think it's a good spot for the queen, and then I can get aggressive on the other side of the board. After knight d7, I play b4, taking away the c5 square. I thought he wanted to go here. After queen g5, we see queen f2, protecting the pawn on e3, doing its job. And now, the crucial moment of the game. Black plays f4. He's actually saying, let's open up the position. Let's make this interesting. And with the bishop pair, the normal thing you say is that bishops are good in open positions, whereas knights are good in closed ones. What does open and closed mean? Well, it's a way of saying how many pawns there are on the board. An open position will have few pawns, and it will feel open because there's more space for the pieces to move. They don't get blocked out by the pawns as often as they normally would. A closed position is what we got after e4, which is, I think, a fantastic move. But why? The principles tell us that with the bishop pair we should have an open position, we should have as few pawns as possible. But in this case, the e4 pawn is doing an excellent job with these other ones, the pawn chain, blocking off the black bishop on b7. So this bishop, inefficient. Now, black was probably really looking forward to this e5 square. It's now a square where he can place his knight right in the middle of the board without it ever being chased away by a white pawn. So it's a fantastic square. The problem is he has two knights wanting to go there. What I'm saying is that you may have this fantastic square because I can play around that one knight, and the other knight will always be bad. You cannot have two knights on the good square at the same time, so he's actually ran out of good squares for the knights. He has one good square and two knights. Any first grader will tell you that if you have one good square and two knights, that's not good. So he played his knight to e5, and I just went rook c1. Now, bishops, still not looking too impressive. My white squared bishop, we were talking about how pawns can get in the way of bishops, and we see that my light squared bishop is pushing on its own pawns. Things are a bit better for the dark squared bishop, but it's kind of being blocked by this fantastic black knight on e5. Look now for the next 5 moves. Seemingly this is fine for black, but as it turns out, it's a complete disaster. Black is trying to get some pressure on the c4 pawn, and I don't care. I'm pushing my pawns on the queen side. One more time. Putting pressure on this b6 pawn. He's defending with his rook, and I go forward with my other pawn, forcing his bishop back to c8. And now bishop a3. There has been a miraculous turn of events, I would say, the last couple of moves. White has gone from, being good but not entirely clear how to proceed, to just pushing those queenside pawns upward and really creating pressure. And we see one of the perks, this bishop gets a new diagonal, putting pressure on this black pawn, which is actually quite difficult to defend. And also look at the black bishop, which has been undeveloped. The white pawns just forcing their way up the board and getting the bishop on a bad square. So This attack on the black pawn is actually forcing a retreat of the magnificent knight. It's going back to f7, and after rook d1, black actually felt forced to play his pawn to e5, simply to get some air for his bishop, which needed a new haven. The transformation has been fantastic also in the way of forcing black to give away his good e5 square. Now I started my maneuvering. Knight b1, I'm hoping to get into the d5 square and also potentially the a4 square. It's all about putting pressure on this pawn where we have some tension on the queen side. And this tension was resolved when black took the pawn on a5. But we don't care. I just went forward with c5, d takes c5, rook takes, getting all the pieces into the attack, and now, finally, the last piece of the puzzle, bishop c4. We've been saying that this bishop has been quite good putting pressure on the black pawn. Finally, we see how the other white bishop can get into play and how magnificent it is once it does. It's putting pressure towards the black king, and we see that after rook takes c5, queen takes c5, the bishops both pointing toward black's king. It's, well, frankly, it's game over. The bishops have shown their strength, and black is busted. And now we see why we didn't mind closing up the position earlier, because we knew that there was potential for forcing black to get on the queen side, open up, put pressure, and when the queen side opens, this was the result we were hoping for. A good attack, pressure against the black pawns, and now also the black king in trouble. Black tries to make an attack of his own. Bishop h3, the biggest threat black ever manages to make in the entire game. But the thing is, I just protect, use the rook as a defender on the second rank. If now knight h4, then we have the bishops and queens getting queen f8 mate. So that's not going to work. Instead, he felt he needed to air some air for his king, getting it out into safety here. But after king h1, it turns out there's no attack, just a trapped bishop. The game continued, queen h4. Now I took the bishop and got my rook on the g file. White is a piece up, completely winning, but I got into time trouble here. And I did my very best to ruin absolutely everything, but even so, I didn't manage to ruin my position enough to mess up the winning game. Now, it finished king h7, queen g1, putting pressure on the knight on g6. Queen takes f3, creates a pin on the rook. And now, if I had played bishop e2, queen takes e4, knight c3, I'm forcing the queen off this diagonal so that my rook can move and take the black knight on the next move. So that would have been much better than what I did, because what I did was knight d2, forcing the queen away from the pin, but losing a piece at the same time, giving away my bishop. Now I thought that I would create an attack towards the black king in the meantime, but I overestimated my attack. Rook c6, threatening queen g6, but black is just in time with knight g4 to stop that threat. Now I want to remove that knight, so I went bishop e6. And now, if he had played queen h3, things could suddenly have become very interesting again. The point being that this check on f5 is not as dangerous as it may have seemed to my opponent. Instead, he tried to play rook to b6. And now after bishop check, g6, and I want to keep my rooks, I play rook c7 check, king h6, and only now do I take the black knight. The point being that takes back, queen takes g4, there's a big mate threat with queen h4, and there's actually no way for black to stop that. Or, I mean, he can stop it, but then he's gonna get mated some other way with my rook doing a massive job on the 7th rank. Instead, my opponent tried to play queen d3, attacking my knight. But after rook d7, rook d6, I have a very nice trick, bishop f5, creating pins all over the place. Now, firstly, the bishop cannot be taken, because then queen g7 is checkmate. The rook cannot be taken, because then there's queen takes g6, checkmate. So my opponent took the knight, which was free to take, and now I'm playing h4, threatening queen to g5, checkmate. Now, my opponent resigned here, understanding that the situation was hopeless. But I want to show one possible line. He has to go f3 to get his queen back, protecting this square. And now I was intending to exploit the pin on the rook, sacrificing my queen on a pawn, but knowing that after he takes back, I'm free to take his queen. And if he were to play something like rook g3, trying to keep his passed pawn on f3, now rook d7 threatens checkmate on h7, and there's no good way to stop it. So what we saw from the bishop pair in this game was that we don't mind necessarily having a closed position if we believe we can open up the position on one side of the board. How the bishops can be an attacking force when they combine their powers towards the opponent's king. This is a game I played with the black pieces against Sebastian Bogner of Switzerland at the European Team Championship in Reykjavik. The game started out as a Queen's Gambit declined through somewhat unorthodox move order, and I chose to play the Ragozin, which is signalized by this bishop b4 move. My opponent chose the line with bishop g5, and after h6 takes, the scene for the game is set. White is going for quick development of the pieces, getting every single piece into play, whereas black has neglected slightly his development, but in return he has the bishop pair. He hopes that he can neutralize the white initiative and in the long run have the bishop pair as a potential asset. All of this has been tested many times, and through practice, one has discovered that this is the best method for black. Other tries could really land him into big trouble. He needs to get his pieces out, and this is the best way of doing that and at the same time putting pressure on the white center. already after 13 moves, white has every single piece into play. The thing is, black is incredibly solid. It's very difficult to find a spot to create an attack, to create unpleasantness for black. The main thing we notice is that black's entire queenside is undeveloped. So white really needs to strike as fast as possible in order to benefit from his development initiative. Here, the seemingly natural knight to c3, both attacking the white queen whilst at the same time protecting your own bishop, was played between Anand and Dubov in the World Rapid Championship. Dubov had the white pieces, and after queen h5, d7, g4 was his idea, really just pushing the g-pawn forward, creating an attack, opening up around the black king. And this was actually a great idea. The plan worked brilliantly, and Dubov, the young Russian, won a fantastic game against the former world champion Anand. Dubov's win made this line very popular, and no doubt my Swiss opponent wanted to take me down in a similar attack. I played bishop to b6, and after rook d1, now I went knight c6. Like Dubov, Bugner went queen h5, but as it turns out, perhaps he should have first taken my rook on d8. What is the point? Bishop takes, queen h5, bishop d7, and now g4. The very same idea Dubov used against Anand. The question is, why does it matter? After knight c6, he went queen to h5. And now I found a really good move, which I was very happy with. I played rook takes d1. Rook takes d1, bishop d7. Now, every single time we've been going through these lines, we've asked ourselves, what happens if white uses g-pawn attacking plan to create trouble for black? My point was that after g4, bishop e8, and now g5, I can create the discovered attack towards the white queen. Now, this was also possible in all the other lines we've seen, but there, white has the excellent move g takes f6, threatening the black queen. The big difference now is that after bishop takes queen on h5, pawn takes queen, there's a knight hanging on f3. And after taking that one, we have an additional threat against the rook and the knight. So my idea of exchanging the rooks before getting my bishop out was that I could sort of trick my opponent into playing the rook to a seemingly better square, but as it turns out, tactically had a crucial significance. So, seeing as how this g4 attacking plan is not so efficient in this instance, my opponent became a bit passive. He went bishop e2, and now, after bishop e8, black has really managed to get his pieces out. I would say the opening is a tremendous success. White's short-term initiative with the development advantage has been extinguished, and black keeps his long-term advantage, the bishop pair. Now, white played knight d6, trying to take our bishop, but I had a plan. I went knight d4, interrupting the connection between the rook and the d6 knight. Also, I'm threatening the bishop on e2. So white needs to take this knight off, and then I can play queen takes d6. This is a very good example of the motto, tactics serving strategic purposes. I mean, we don't need to be just good at strategy or just good at tactics. We need to know our strategy so that we know what kind of tactics to look for. The position has calmed down. We have a symmetrical pawn structure, but black keeps his bishop pair. And just in a couple of moves, we'll see really how powerful that bishop pair can get. White plays knight b5, queen goes back, queen e5, and putting the rook on the open file. Now, white keeps trying to eliminate one of the black bishops, and were he to succeed, the game would probably just end in a draw. But after knight d6, rook c5 moves the rook that was threatened and also creates trouble for the white queen. Now, queen f4 loses to bishop c7. So he felt he had to go queen e4. And now I'm just saving my bishop while at the same time putting a threat to the white queen. Queen b4, and now actually I blundered. The very easy, straightforward, good move would have been rook to g5. Look at these two bishops pointing down toward the white king. The tactics are working brilliantly. If white plays g3, then bishop c5 creates a very unpleasant double threat towards the knight and the queen. So white really has to play e4, and here we see an example of a pawn stopping one diagonal for the bishop, but in turn opens up another one, and the weakening of this last diagonal really is his downfall. And with a move like queen f6, combining the threats, black is just completely dominating the game. Now, why didn't I play rook g5, you ask? I have no idea. Well, I kind of have an idea. I played rook c2, which I thought was also winning just instantly. But it turned out I had miscalculated a specific line. After bishop d3, I thought I could now play queen g5. And if the knight blocks the diagonal of the bishop, I was threatening checkmate, then I had the idea of playing rook takes f2. A big strike hoping to get the queen into e3. But as it turns out, and the thing that I had missed, is that, well, the queen is just hanging. So knight takes g5 and white survives the assault. So going back after bishop d3, I had to reconsider. I decided to go bishop c5, queen b3, and now I'm making a sacrifice of necessity. It's the only good move in the position simply because I managed to trap my own rook. But it's a good move, so it's fine. Rook takes f2, eliminating one of the important pawns in front of the white king, and also just next move, take the knight back. A very patient move. I had the option of giving a check with the queen, but I choose instead just to take the knight back and have the option later to decide where to give a check with my queen depending on how white responds. Now take a look at the two black bishops. They are pointing massively down towards the white king side and the white king. Actually, this position is just good for black. He has sacrificed a rook for a bishop and pawn, but what bishops he has. White would give anything to exchange his rook for another pawn in front of the king and a dark squared bishop to guard the king side. Facing these monster bishops would be difficult with 1 hour on the clock, let alone the 5 minutes he actually had. Now he went queen c4, and after queen g5, black threatens the pawn on g2 with a mating attack, and after g3 there's another threat, only this time it's double, both the pawn and the rook. White cannot guard both threats, so he felt he needed to let the pawn go. King e1, queen takes the pawn. Bishop back, queen takes another pawn. Black is up to 3 pawns for the exchange, and the entire white king side has been annihilated. It was only gonna get worse. White's king is still in trouble, and after bishop e5, he tried mounting a counterattack, his best chance of getting anything from this game. Giving a check, getting the rook on the open file, and trying to get into the black position. But by going bishop f6, first forcing the white queen back, and then taking the 4th pawn, there's just nothing white can do. He continued his plan of the counterattack, but after queen e5, queen d8, I felt that it's time to exchange off the queens and let the pawns decide this game. Now, black has 4 pawns and a bishop for a rook, and that's more than enough. The bishop pair is doing an excellent job of guiding the black pawns to becoming a new queen, and my chosen one was the h-pawn, the one furthest away from the white king. I'm just gonna keep pushing this one until it becomes a queen. After bishop c4, bishop g2, in the long run there's no stopping the black pawns, and white decided to resign and put himself out of the misery. In my opinion, this is a very classical bishop pair game. We start out a bit on the defensive, because while we got the bishop pair, our opponent got a big development advantage. So at the beginning, it's all about neutralizing the opponent's initiative. And having managed that, then we can start thinking about our aggressive intentions. And the second lesson we had in this game is the power of the bishop pair against a weakened king. We saw that a bishop and a pawn, and this game is from the European Team Championship in Reykjavik. If you've watched all my videos on the bishop pair, you will be very familiar with the opening that was played. Once again, it was a Rogozin opening, and a line which is very popular for white at the moment, playing bishop g5 and surrendering the bishop pair, hoping to get a development initiative. So far, the game has progressed exactly the same way as my previous game against Sebastian Bogner. Bogner, he played a3, which is a different plan, hoping to get a strong initiative with the queen in a central position after bishop a5, queen takes d4. Banikas chose a different line. He went knight takes d4. The idea is that white tries to trap the bishop on b4. If he is successful, he will remove the black trump, the bishop pair, while still retaining his development initiative. With his last move, white is taking away the escape square on a5 for the black bishop. So now a3 is a big threat. Black has two choices. He can allow white to get the bishop, claiming that it has taken white so much time that the short-term initiative has evaporated in the meanwhile. Alternately, he can stick to his guns, going into complicated tactics including a pawn sacrifice just for the purpose of keeping the bishop. I was well prepared for the tactics, so I went with the pawn sacrifice, knight to a5. Black is simply exchanging off the knights, making sure that the bishop regains its escape square on a5. However, this does allow rook c7, white getting the rook in a very aggressive position, and if black were to try to exchange off this rook with rook c8, then there's a very nice tactic. Rook takes d7, takes back, check on f6, and suddenly there's a discovered check on h7, threatening both the king and the queen, with white getting a decisive material advantage. In order to prevent this trick, I went with my rook to d8, protecting the bishop. There are two ways for white to accept the pawn sacrifice. Firstly, he can just take on a5, takes back, and grab the pawn on b7. However, after queen f8, getting the queen away from this pin, there's a real danger that the rook on b7 is going to be trapped. On his next move, black will play bishop b6, and there's no easy way out for the white rook. If he tries to escape immediately with rook b3, there's a nasty pin, bishop a4. Instead, Banikas went for a3, trying to push the bishop away. Now, I need the a5 square for my bishop, so first I exchange off the knights and then have the square available. Once again, the rook can take on b7, but now black has some nice tactics, starting with bishop a4, creating an attack towards the rook and the queen at the same time. There's a queen exchange, after which the black rook is doing a very good job on the open file. After knight c5, bishop b6, we get another exchange, but essentially what happens is that the active black rook, with its partner coming soon, provides black with full compensation for the extra pawn white has on b2. Even so, that was the best option for white. In the game, my opponent played the rook back to c1, and that's just way too passive. When white gave away the bishop pair, it was because he would get a development advantage. With this retreat, white gives away anything reminiscent of an initiative, and instead it's black's turn to run the show. In this next phase of the game, my main priority is to make sure that white cannot exchange off the light squared bishops. I want to keep both my bishops, the force that is the bishop pair. Of course, the main line I had to calculate is what happens if white tries to exchange off the bishops. My assessment was that after bishop a4, we go into an endgame in which black has very good chances thanks to his active rooks. This pawn on a3 will get into some serious trouble the next couple of moves. Here, I chose to regroup my bishop. Rather than on a5 where it's now, it would much rather be on f6 pointing down towards the white queenside pawns. Once again, it's important to know what to do if bishop e4 trying to exchange off the bishops. In this case, I was planning taking and going queen a4 and queen b3. This queen is putting some good pressure on the white queenside pawns, cooperating with the bishop coming on the long diagonal. So far, so good. Black has kept the bishops, but it's still a symmetrical position. How do you make progress? I tried a very standard and I think very good plan. Grabbing space. This pawn advance seems pretty innocent. But spoiler alert, this pawn actually ends up deciding the game. After some thought, I decided to go for an endgame. Black is definitely better, but it's by no means over. It's just more pleasant to play black. It's easier. You know where to put your pieces. Like always, white would love to exchange the light squared bishops. Here, he had the opportunity with bishop a4. This could have resulted in the most amazing computer line, even in symmetrical and seemingly boring positions. We have a classic scenario of the bishop versus the knight. One of the advantages of the bishop is that you often choose when to exchange. Here, black goes into a pawn ending, but he gets the advantage of splitting up the white pawns. White got rid of his weakness, the c3 pawn, so seemingly, if anybody is better, it's white, threatening to go after the pawn on a7, creating a passed pawn of his own on the a file. However, the computer sees deeper, and it understands that black has the chance of getting a passed pawn by force on the other side. It's a race. Who's going to win? White ends up getting the queen first, but black ends up with the pawn extra. It's amazing what computers can come up with. This is best play by both players, and it seems to end up with black having an extra pawn in a queen ending. Of course, I didn't calculate this entire variation during the game. It's simply too complicated for humans. But it's really fascinating to see the lines the computer can generate and how amazing chess can be, even the options you didn't see during the game. These days, we have endgame databases which have the answer to whether these positions with few pieces left are a draw or a win for one of the players. In this particular case, it's a draw regardless of white losing his h-pawn or not, but in a practical game, it can be really difficult to defend just like a computer. Back to the game, my opponent chose King F1 instead. Both players are just improving their positions, getting the kings in for the endgame, and getting my bishop on the long diagonal, threatening towards the white queen side. Black is definitely better, but he needs to open up the position to exploit the strengths of his bishops. My idea was to go g4, trying to open up the diagonal for my c6 bishop. In turn, white tries to block off this diagonal even more. Initially, the computer recommends this move. However, closer analysis reveals that this is actually losing by force. Once again, we see a scenario in which white manages to exchange off the light squared bishops. However, I have made sure that every time this scenario occurs, it's at a cost for white. The bishop pair has done its job. Now it's time for the lone bishop to show its superiority against the knight. My opponent tried sacrificing a pawn with knight takes e4. It may seem a bit strange, but the thing was that if he took with the pawn, there's real trouble coming with the black king. Suddenly, it has a clear route to get pressure against the g2 pawn. Computer analysis confirms that this is a winning position for black, although its method of winning is very unorthodox. After king e3, preventing the black king from entering on the dark squares, black plays a5. A very strange move, but black wins by force, going into a pawn ending in which the black pawns win the race. King takes c3 is impossible after king e5, the king going back, and now it has let black go for this weak pawn on g2. Instead, he'll have to take back with the pawn. When b6 is a great move in this fantastic pawn ending. The point is that after king d4, b5, it's a position of mutual zugzwang. That means whoever is to move has to worsen his position. That's why black chose to go first one step and then another step to get this position with white to move instead of black to move. After white retreating, black comes up. And this time, it's the weakness of the a3 pawn that seals white's fate. So with his pawn sacrifice, knight takes e1, he's hoping that the centrally placed knight can create enough counterplay to make a draw. The knight is a good offensive piece as well as defensive, threatening the pawn on g5, but also keeping a look at the entry square on g3, where black really wants to get his king in order to capture the g2 pawn. Seemingly, white has some kind of a fortress on the king side and an active king, but it all turns out to be an illusion. The king is on the hunt, going after the black pawn on a7. However, through tactics and demonstrating the power of the long-range piece, the bishop, black manages to avoid this threat. Now, if the king takes the pawn, there's a discovered check b5, so that's off the table. To capture this a7 pawn, he needs to bring his knight, but it comes at a cost. Black is going to lose his two queenside pawns, but now we see how effective the long-range bishop is. It has been doing a great job defending both flanks simultaneously, whereas the white knight had to maneuver out of its defensive position to go on offense on the queen side. The time it takes for the knight to go on offense has enabled black to use his king to infiltrate through on the king side. White is just way behind in the race. Here, bishop d2 is a good move, making sure to eliminate the white pawn as soon as possible. After a5, white does win a piece, but there's nothing he can do against the advance of the h4 pawn. Black is trying to use his knight to attack the black pawns, eliminating every single one of them. But once again, black just leaves the bishop hanging, knowing that his h-pawn will decide the game. In the end, it turns out black is the one to get the piece up after h3. My calculations showed that I could get the knight and keep my last pawn at the same time. And now for the last accurate move. After bishop b8, white resigned. Notice that after bishop d6 instead, that would be a horrendous mistake, as after a5, the king doesn't really get back in time. a6 threatens promotion, the bishop has to go back, and now, through a pawn sacrifice, white gets a hold of the last black pawn, and the game would have ended. It's a game I played this Christmas season, and I think it's actually the best game I've ever played. And it's a real display of the power of the bishops on an open board. I was playing the black pieces against the very solid Polish grandmaster Mikhail Krasenkow. It was a d4 game, and after the first couple of moves, we entered into what is the Rogozin opening. And that is no coincidence, because this is an opening in which white very early on gives away his bishop pair and says, it's fine, you can get my bishop, but in return I'm hoping for quick development and good placement of my pieces. He plays queen a4 check, which is actually an interesting move. It's forcing black to go with his knight in between the check in order to protect the threatened bishop. Now this knight is important because it's blocking the pawn on c7. This is a pawn you really want to move into the center in order to counter white's current central control. So that's why white early on brings out his queen in order to misplace the black knight. Now, black's queen is causing some trouble for white, putting pressure on the pawn on g2 in order to make it difficult for white to develop his bishop. So what white chooses to do is get rid of this queen by offering a queen exchange. It's move 13, and white has still not castled his king. Normally, in these Rogosian lines, white is really quick to castle and get play in the center. In this case, his development is almost as good as black's, but what he's hoping for is that there's other advantages than development advantage. There's specifically a point of space. White has two aggressively placed pawns putting pressure on the center, whereas black really only has one. Part of what white is hoping to achieve is that this central space can be used to have more space for maneuvering and thereby getting his pieces in better spots than black. Talking about good spots for the pieces, I think we should especially take a look at the bishop on c7. It's currently being blocked by its own pawn. It has real trouble finding a good square where it can really contribute to black's aim of using the menacing bishop pair. In this position, I decided that I wanted white to make a decision about the tension between these two pawns in the center. I played knight a5, threatening the pawn on c4 and telling it, well, if you want to exchange for the pawn, that would be very favorable for me, as now I would get my bishop out to an aggressive spot on f5. Therefore, my opponent was not interested in opening the diagonal for the black bishop, so he chose instead to go forward with the pawn, taking more space but not relinquishing the pressure against this central pawn. Now, that is a fact that enables me to try to move the defender of this pawn. There's no more pressure on d5. Let me try to move the e-pawn forward and opening up for this bishop on c8. To achieve this, I go back with the knight where it came from. It achieved what I wanted it to do on the rim, and now it's going back into the control, fighting for central squares on e5 and d4. White continues his strategy of taking space on the queen side, playing b4, but now I have a very interesting move, g5. Just like white is taking a lot of space on the queen side, I can try to take space on the king side. Now this g5 move is really a multi-purpose move. It has a lot of valuable ideas. Usually, the more ideas there are connected to a move, the better, because it's difficult for your opponent to defend against three ideas at the same time. Now, firstly, I'm considering getting my bishop to a better diagonal, to the g7 square, fianchetto, where it points up towards these central squares. Now, in a dream world, I would really like to break in the center with e5, which also opens up the diagonal for my bishop stuck in the parking garage on c8. The last point of this move is to put pressure on the knight on f3. This knight is doing a good job of helping white control the squares black really wants to take over. And black now gets the option of pushing the pawn forward to g4 at an opportune moment, thereby chasing the knight away from its good placement. Now, this last idea is something that my opponent wanted to hear nothing about. So he played the move g4, a very radical move really just stopping by brute force the pawn's advancement by blocking it with a pawn of his own. This is one of the key moments in the game. I chose to sacrifice a pawn with e5, and after knight takes, d takes, I thought that it's good for me to open up a diagonal for my bishop on c8. But I have other positive things about my position. After a5, I'm also thinking about getting the rook into play, even though it didn't move in the entire game. I'm opening up the a file so that the rook can get a good spot there. Also, notice that white cannot really fight for the a file, so my rook will get it all on its own. The final step in my plan is being really casual about trying to winning back this pawn on e5. I'm taking my time playing c6, creating a good barrier of pawns here. Now these pawns are doing a fantastic job of restricting the activity of the white pieces, specifically the knight and the bishop. The white knight would really like to go to this square on d4, but now with my pawn blocking that option, it really needs to find another route. Also notice the white bishop. It cannot find a really good spot because every time it goes to what would normally be an active spot, it bites on this really powerful, rock solid pawn formation. It cannot get a good way to attack the pawns from behind. Now I'm ready to try to win back the pawn, playing bishop g7, and to avoid my bishop getting the pawn back and really just dominating the board, my opponent is forced to play f4, which potentially leaves a lot of weak squares in its wake. So far, so good. Black has the bishop pair, but both bishops are being blocked out of the game by white pawns. So what I need to do is open up diagonals for the bishops. Now, the natural move would be to go f6, giving white the option of exchanging this extra pawn, thereby guaranteeing him to be a pawn up, but then also getting pressure on the open e-file, as well as potentially getting down with the rook, creating pressure in so many ways. And also notice the bishop with its fantastic diagonal and no white counterpart. However, if I were to play f6, white has the really powerful move e4. And after a pawn takes e4, he can just block the position of the black bishops. He can go sacrifice another pawn, play f5, and if black now takes the pawn on e5, look at the transformation of the position. We were talking about how white was a pawn up, but potentially black could have these really powerful bishops. Now the black bishops are just horrendous. This bishop is pointing towards the white pawn on f5, which is protected by another pawn. There's no way this bishop is getting to a good position. And let's take a look at the other bishop, the star of the game, the black squared bishop, which has no black squared counterpart in the white camp. It's completely ruined. This was supposed to be the star piece of the black army, but it's completely ruined by the fact that there's a black pawn blocking its diagonal, and as it turns out, black would rather lose this pawn and have an open diagonal for the black bishop rather than having the pawn on the board. So, having this in mind, I took the pawn on f4, undoubling the white pawns, but guaranteeing that there would be no e4 break when I chose to play f6, opening up and removing the white pawn that was blocking my bishop's diagonal. Takes, bishop takes, h3, rook a3. Take a look at this position. We have the black rook on a3, putting real pressure on the third rank. And in addition, we have the star player, the bishop on f6, putting pressure down the diagonal towards white's knight. Now, if this knight were to retreat, all kinds of problems would arise. This knight is doing the best job of keeping the entry squares for the black pieces. This knight is doing the best job of keeping the black pieces out. So he needs to keep it where it is. Playing rook d3. But now white is completely tied down to defending this knight in different ways. And he really has no offensive plan. It's all about defense. Yes, he's a pawn up, but what good is this pawn if he just has to stay still, hoping for the best? In the meanwhile, it's not entirely clear how black can strike through this defensive idea. So I actually took the time to just improve my pieces a little bit, moving the king up and also getting the bishop into play. Now, white really wants to improve his knight without letting anything bad happen. He now tried to play knight d1, which has a very sound idea. The knight is going to e3 and then potentially trying to get up to f5 and finally doing some kind of aggressive idea. The thing is, there was a catch, but it's a beautiful catch. Rook a4 threatens the pawn, so the rook has to go to b3. Now, the idea was that the discovered attack, d4, is not so dangerous. Yes, it threatens the rook on b3, but now that black moved his rock-solid pawn formation, it gives more space for the white bishop, which these pawns were just shutting out of the play. So now the bishop steps up, goes to c4, and seemingly this was a great success for white. He got his bishop into play and is trying to exchange off the black bishop pair. But I had a good move I had to see before playing d4, before letting this bishop back into the game. I had the move rook a2. I'm basically saying to white, come take my rook, I don't care, because my bishop pair is so much more valuable than my little rook. Now, there's a very concrete idea as to why this works. After takes, bishop takes c4, and now if rook a3, if I were to just take back the rook immediately, I've achieved nothing except exchanging off a rook and a bishop for a rook and a bishop. I lost my bishop pair, I'm still a pawn down, and in this position, if anyone is better, it's white with the extra pawn. So this was not my idea at all. I had a completely different trick in mind, because I wanted to show the power of the bishop pair with bishop h4, creating a mating net around the white king. At the moment, I'm actually threatening checkmate in one move, with moving the bishop back to d5. So white desperately needs some air for his king in order to let it escape the magnificent bishops. If he tries g5, making a square on g4, it's just h5. Access denied. So the king has to go back in order to find a safe haven. But now bishop d5 check forces the king into the corner, and now rook e1 threatens checkmate in one move. White still has a defense. He can go knight f2. And now the big question, do you want to take this rook on a2 or do you not? And the answer is don't take it. The bishop is much more valuable than this white rook. We go rook f1, and now since the black bishop is still on the diagonal pointing towards the white king, the knight cannot move without it being checkmate. And on the very next move, a black will just take the knight with his bishop, threatening checkmate once again, and the bishop pair has gotten back all the material that was invested and more to it, with checkmate soon to come. Instead, my opponent tried a creative defensive plan. He tried g5 in this position. Now, if I were to take this pawn, then he could try to escape with his rook, saying that the best thing black can do now is give away his bishop for this rook, as the checkmate ideas no longer work when white has the square on g4 to put his king. That's why I thought, let's not take this pawn. Instead, I just took the rook on b3, giving back the bishop on f6, but keeping the bishop, which is now attacking both the rook and the knight. Rook d2 defends both. But here is a very good and important point about bishops and the bishop pair. More often than not, when you have the bishop, you are the one who gets to choose when to exchange off a bishop for a knight. If the knight attacks the bishop, very often you can just move it back and the knight cannot take your bishop. Whereas when the bishop attacks the knight, since it's a more long-range piece, it's more difficult for the knight to escape. In this instance, I chose to exchange off my fantastic bishop for a knight on the rim. Normally, that looks like a terrible decision, but I found out that after takes, and rook e3 check, this is actually just a winning rook endgame for black. The idea is that if the white king goes aggressively up to g4, then h5 check, gambiting this pawn just to make sure the king is far away on the side of the board, takes, king f5, threatening checkmate in one move. Now the pawn can save itself, but now we have a situation where there's a passed pawn for black supported by the king. And for instance, after king h6, black just goes rook g3, making sure that there's no way the white king is getting back into play. And in the meantime, black will just gobble up this white pawn and use his king to help the passed pawn queen. So, king g4 is not a good move, but if the king goes back, like my opponent did in the game, then after rook e4, there's no way to guard this pawn on f4. If he tried through king g3, king f5, rook f1, once again we would have a situation in which the d pawn, the passed pawn, is the star of the game. And after a d3, white would be overloaded with the fact that the black rook can take the pawn on b4, is putting pressure on the pawn on f4, and at the same time the d pawn is very close to becoming a new queen. My opponent tried defending with rook d3, but now just taking the pawn, black still has his main trump, the d pawn. And I also have the king helping out, helping to push the pawn forward. After rook g7, I don't really care too much about this pawn on b7. I just care about getting my d pawn to queen, giving a check, making sure that the king stays away from the d pawn. And after rook c1, I'm threatening to just go down and queen the pawn. If now rook takes b7, the pawn helped by the rook just queens. So instead, white starts a big plan of checking my king so that I actually have to go in the way of my pawn. I'm gonna have to hide my king from the checks, and the only spot to hide is on the queening square for the pawn. But I'm not too concerned because after rook takes b7, d2, if I can just get my king out, the pawn will queen. So white will have to prevent my king from getting out, but I can get out on two different sides of this pawn. And after checking on b1, I can go king c1 on the next move, and there's no way to stop the black pawn from queening. Therefore, in essence, I've managed to stop white from taking my pawn on b7. And when white doesn't get this pawn, he has no counterplay. The game ended king b2, d2, rook e4, check, and rook c3. Now I'm threatening to take the pawn on h3, and if this pawn moves, then my king is getting out, getting a free square on c2 and helping my pawn queen on the next move. So after rook c3, my opponent resigned. I actually think this was one of my best games ever. And with regards to the bishop pair, we can see that black sacrificed a pawn, but in return he opened up the diagonals for his bishops, and white's pieces didn't really have any safe squares. The white knight on c3 was getting attacked by the rooks, by the bishop, and when it had to move, actually the white position just collapsed immediately, much thanks to the fantastic combination with rook a2, the, the move that gave away the rook for the bishop. But that combination would not work if not for this mating pattern with the two bishops cooperating brilliantly and checkmating the white king first on the middle of the board, so the king had to hide in the corner. The power of the fianchettoed bishop. And our illustration game today will be my game loss against the former world champion Vishwanathan Anand in the 2015 Norway chess tournament. This was actually my last black game of the tournament, and Anand played c4. And at the press conference after the game, he jokingly commented that he felt he had to play the English opening c4 against me because everybody else earlier in the tournament had done the same. And that was the trend, and I stuck to my guns. Once again, playing e5, saying that controlling the center is the way to go against one of these kind of flank openings. And the fianchetto came, and we had the very same beginning to the game as I had 3 times earlier in the tournament. Every one of those times, my opponent had a different idea to get me thinking on my own. This time was no different. Anand played an unusual order of moves. So the moves he made were normal, but the order in which he made them was not. Instead of going out with his knight, getting the king into safety as early as possible, Anand chose to go bishop e3 and then rook c1, delaying the development of the knight so that you have the option with white after knight c6 to take this knight, ruin the black pawn structure, and then develop your knight, getting the king into safety. Now, Alexander Grishuk had played a similar idea against me earlier in the tournament, and in that instance, I had let him give away his fianchettoed bishop because I thought it's gonna be fine. It's not the end of the world that my pawn structure is slightly crippled. Having lost that game in a pretty bad fashion, I decided that this time I'm not gonna let him take my knight. So I went aggressively with f5, provoking him to now move his knight out, and then I get my knight into play. And you might ask, why did he go through all of this trouble when he eventually had to develop his knight in order to get his king into safety? Well, what he achieved was that he provoked me into playing this f5 move. And that's not just a good thing for me. It can also be a weakness. Because now it's more difficult to protect this pawn on e5 since I can't use the f pawn as a defender. And we also see in the next couple of moves, castling, getting the bishop out, Anand goes b4, a very interesting move, basically offering the pawn to both the black knight and the black bishop. But in each case, white is doing well. If the knight takes on b4, then you've left the pawn on e5 unguarded, and white is very happy to exchange a b pawn for a good central pawn on e5. So taking with the knight is not going to work. What about taking with the bishop? If bishop takes, then white goes knight g5, threatening the bishop on e6. And when the bishop retreats, we see one of the faults of the f5 move. It has opened a diagonal towards the black king, and in this instance, because of trouble with the bishop on b4, white just wins. So, after having found out that taking the pawn was off the table, I decided that I had to do something against the threat of going forward once more, going with the pawn to b5, attacking my knight and making it go away from the defense of the pawn on e5. So, logically, I went a6 to stop that, and Anand went a3 just to protect his pawn. After king h8, knight a4, some exchanges and putting the bishop in the middle of the board, a good central square on d5, I was actually quite happy about my position. I felt that black had decent central control, and the fact that my pawn on e5 in some cases might get into trouble, I felt I got things under control. But what happened was that I underestimated the potential dangers of my position. And very often, when you think you're fine, you should always pay attention to what's the opponent's plan and how can I get into trouble. I was too focused on only my ideas, and I underestimated the power of his. He played bishop c5, and I went bishop d6. As it turns out, maybe I should have exchanged these bishops. Bishop takes c5 looks unnatural because I'm basically helping white get a doubled rooks on the c file. But after queen d6, the rook doubling and getting my corner rook into play on the d file, black is actually doing quite well because the doubled rooks on the c file can't really get past the black knight. And after moves like queen d1, e4, pushing white back in the center, black is doing very fine. It's about an equal position. So what was wrong with what I did? Well, seemingly nothing was wrong. But after bishop d6, queen back to c2, black getting his queen to f6, white had the move e4, finally trying to stake his claim to the center of the board. And as it turns out, I had underestimated the power of this move. Now, if pawn takes on e4, pawn takes back, bishop goes back, it's seemingly a pretty good position for black. If he gets to exchange off these black squared bishops, he can hope to get very good control of this d4 square. But the crucial point here is that white retreats his bishop to e3 to make sure that this bishop is never exchanged and can keep an eye on the d4 square. And if black tries to chase away the knight in order to put his knight on the d4 square, then white is just happy to oblige. Take that knight and now push the pawns. We see these two central pawns very quickly going up the board, and combined with the pressure on the c file, this is just a catastrophe for black. So, getting this e4 move in my face, I had a clever idea. I thought, I'll go back with the bishop first, because now, with the same retreat we saw earlier, black has to move f4, which causes all kinds of trouble for white. The thing is, white has an in-between move. He captures the pawn on f5 and then goes back with his bishop. Once again, we see the importance of keeping the bishop so it can always exchange itself when the black knight gets up to the d4 square. Let's try to evaluate the position. White has a very good square on e4, which he hopes to use for either a knight or a bishop. when the white knight moves, he also opens up the diagonal for the fianchettoed bishop. And this bishop is, number one, putting pressure on the knight, essentially threatening to win a pawn, but also it's difficult for black to put anything in the way. He can't really get a pawn or something like that to stomp the bishop from where it stands on g2. So there are problems in the black position. Actually, the computer thinks the position is about equal, but I think this is one of the rare cases where the computer doesn't understand the dangers black is facing. During the game, I felt my position was really unpleasant, and I decided that attack is the best defense. So I went a4. After b5, I just retreated my knight, but now at the very least having a threat with the bishop putting pressure on the a3 pawn. Anand played bishop g5, forcing my queen back, hoping to get some defense with his queen at the same time as putting pressure on the pawn on e5. h6, exchanging the knights, and we get to this crucial point after knight h4. And once again, we see how the fianchetto bishop has no opposition in the long diagonal and is just doing a fantastic job of putting pressure down there. Also, the white knight is threatening to take the light squared bishop on f5. So one option I could have played was bishop h7, but I was concerned that after bishop takes b7, rook b8, bishop coming back to e4, the combination of the bishop and the knight, and looking at these light squares around the black king, I thought this was extremely dangerous. As it turns out, with the computer's help, this would have been much better than what I did. And often it's that in bad positions we make bad moves. And that was certainly the case for me here. I played bishop takes a3, thinking that my attack against the white rook would give me some time to figure out my defensive strategy. But Anand, just using his own bishop, taking on b7, and threatening a rook of his own. I went into a long exchange with bishop takes c1, but as it turns out, when we look at what happened after white got his rook on a8, black actually ended up a pawn down. So a lot of exchanges, pawn down, but there's opposite colored bishops. Maybe there's some hope for black to salvage a draw, seeing as how opposite colored bishops often are drawish. So what are black's drawing chances here? I think they're very close to zero. And that is because not only is white a pawn up, you have to look at the difference between the white bishop and the black bishop. At the moment, the black bishop is doing a good job threatening down towards the white king, but the white king can just step out of this pin, and what is the black bishop doing then? Also, take a look at this square on e4. We'll move ahead. Bishop e4. It's a square where there are no black pawns to chase away this bishop. And the bishop is protected by its own pawn, centrally located, one of the absolute best squares available on the board. And it's actually doing such a good job pointing down towards the black king, pointing up on the queen side, and also, need be, it can help in defense. And after a couple of moves, we'll see that there's almost nothing black can do. He can just sit and wait while white slowly but surely increases his pressure. The last move, h4, is threatening to go one step further to h5 and making sure that black's king is always going to be stuck in the corner. Now, I didn't want to allow that, so I played h5, trying to set up a kind of strategy of putting my pawns on light squares in order to counter the light squared bishop. So I need to put my pawns on light squares to make sure that the bishop doesn't have complete influence over the board's light squares. My problem was that after queen d2, my strategy of going with g6 on the next move, it runs into queen h6 check. And without playing g6, how can I protect the pawn on h5? As it turns out, h5 was just a big blunder. And now after queen f6, Anand had a trap. He went queen e2, and after g6, being happy to get these pawns on the light squares until Anand proved his point. Bishop takes g6, a tactical operation in which white ends up being 3 pawns up after this clever check. So 3 pawns down,